Can you give me an example, any of the three of you, of someone who you've convinced to do something tomorrow when they were looking at it as something that, oh, maybe I'll see this in my lifetime, that you got them to think in a much quicker iteration?
Yeah, I think resiliency, Hurricane Sandy, pushed some of that. I started talking with East Coast people and they said, well, how can we become more resilient? And their answer to that question was, I need to immediately be able to power up my Walgreens, my CVS, my Waffle House, all of those services that we use every day. I need energy for those. And so then we asked the question of them, well, what about water? Aren't you going to need water at your Waffle House too? Because you're going to be cleaning dishes and making stuff, right? And then each one of these customers, how are they going to complete a transaction using a credit card if you have no internet connection, if you have no connections? And so it really opened some of their eyes in looking at resiliency instead of just power up, lights on, as to how can I fortify and how can I create this distributed generation for water, if you will, along with electricity and communication. Alvin Brown in Jacksonville was a good friend, and as you know, they've got military, they've got industry, they've got everything in Jacksonville. Unfortunately, he didn't win the election, so to the earlier point, you know, elected officials that buy in, sometimes they're gone, and the new elected official isn't as bought in because it was the previous mayor's, one of their platform issues. So East Coast has really had some favorable. In the water realm, around the Great Lakes, around some of the issues about finding some of the contaminants in the Great Lakes water and how to treat those. They've been looking for sensors in the water world. How do they detect those faster? I don't know that that prevents a Flint, but it is certainly one of those trend analyses that you can see a problem coming before it realistically happens. And then out on the West Coast, working with some of the people in the new technologies for the fast train and the Hyperloop and the direct potable reuse of water, all of those things have a sustainable, a smart, and resilient component. So I kind of twist my hat kind of depending on what region of the United States I'm in, but each one has a story that you can connect to and push little bits at a time, never the whole thing.
Clint, the good news is, you know, a lot of people were convinced when circumstances presented themselves on the East Coast. The bad news is, why do you need a hurricane? Wouldn't it be better if Clint did it, the convincing, as opposed to Hurricane Sandy? Number one, you don't get a lot of Hurricane Sandys. Number two, you don't want any Hurricane Sandys, really, even though I went through it and was evacuated for 2 weeks out of my home.
You know, preparedness is a funny thing. Some people are really good at it and some people really aren't very good at it. It takes an emergency management situation to drive people towards change. It took the bridge collapse in Minneapolis to rise to the occasion that bridges needed to be looked at more. It took the Flint, Michigan issue to talk about the lead and copper rule. It takes typically something that drives people towards that solution. You know, if I asked how many of you carry a roadside emergency kit in your car, which would be prudent, most of you do not, because you need your space in your car for something else. Yet a spare tire you would never go without. So it's always a question of what are we doing towards that preparedness. The thing I really like about our current message about sustainable, smart, and resilient is that putting resiliency in with those other components says we're going to do something that's going to help you trend and analyze and understand before a failure point arrives. We want you to be ready for that when it hits. And the only way we can do that is to collect this data, analyze this data, and then provide potentially a remote asset to look at that and see when it's coming. So you can tell somebody to be prepared all day long, but it's usually the hurricane's coming, the tornadoes, you know, down the block, the ground saturated and Houston is now underwater, the earthquake, and then they go, gosh, we should have done that. So I don't want to be Chicken Little, but at the same time, if I can provide form and function and say, well, you got to have a pipe, so why don't we put something in the pipe that makes it more resilient? So I think we are getting them towards preparedness with their everyday lives without them realizing that we're getting them towards preparedness.